Hello, welcome to All Saints Church Sanderstead for our Good Friday 3-hour devotional service. Our service is divided into 3 parts, each part beginning on the hour, so 12 o'clock now, then 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock. And each part will consist of a reading from the scriptures, a talk, then a prayer, and then some music to aid us in our meditation. Good Friday is known in some churches as Great Friday or Holy Friday. You may remember that Jesus was betrayed by Judas, and then he was tried by the Jewish council for blasphemy. The mob condemned him, and Pilate, the Roman governor, went along with the verdict, and Jesus was sentenced to be crucified. He was made to carry his own cross to the place of execution, the place of the skull. Here he hung for 6 long hours before he died. At the time of his death there was an earthquake. After his death, the followers of Jesus took his body away and buried it in a rock tomb. 2 days later, on Easter Sunday, Jesus was raised to life. Good Friday is for us a day of sadness, of solemn commemoration, but a day of deep, deep gratitude that Jesus, the Son of God, suffered and died for us, for you and for me. Our scripture readings are taken from the Gospel of St. Matthew. This is St. Matthew chapter 27, beginning at verse 11. Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew it was out of envy that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the 2 do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called Christ?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified.
Today we're going to spend some time reflecting on the events of that first Good Friday from some other different perspectives. And the title of these devotions is 4 Men, 3 Crosses. And in our first hour, our attention will be on the events from the perspective of Barabbas. Now, first, I have to say that we know really relatively little about Barabbas. His name is actually quite interesting. The first part, B-A-R, bar, if you like, signifies the son of. And then Abba, that signifies a close, intimate relationship between a father and his child, as well as the childlike trust that a young child puts in his daddy. That's what Abba really means. You've probably heard that name before. It's actually a very endearing term, and it's something that tells of a very close relationship with the Father. You remember when Jesus was praying in Gethsemane, and he addresses his Father as Abba, Father. It's not a name actually that you would associate with a rough criminal like Barabbas. According to Luke's Gospel, Barabbas had a background of violent criminality. Now he seems to have reached the end of the road. He'd been thrown into prison for his part in a violent uprising that had happened in Jerusalem. Many believe that he was a leader of the Jewish patriots who wanted to drive out the detested Romans from the city. And so maybe to some Jews he was a freedom fighter. But as you know, one person's freedom fighter can be another person's terrorist. And Mark chapter 15 verse 7 tells us that he was in prison with the rest of the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. So to the Roman governors, Barabbas was guilty as charged, if you like. No doubt about that. He'd been caught, he'd been convicted, and he'd been condemned. Condemned to be crucified, to be tied and hung to a wooden cross, raised up for all to see. He must have seen that punishment meted out to others, so he would know only too well what it entailed: the pain, the bloodshedding, the agony, the mockery, the bitter disgrace, the stones, the death itself, and after which his body will be torn to shreds by the crows. And there he lay in his pitch-dark prison, surrounded no doubt by stench and blackness, and he lay awaiting his cross. Now, what do you think a man thinks about the night before he's due to be executed? Think about that for a few moments. Now, there were a couple of others, criminals with whom he had perhaps been associated, convicted robbers, violent thieves, and they perhaps lay in the adjacent cells, and they were probably groaning in anticipation of their punishment, in the full knowledge that they too were going to receive actually what they deserved. So they too were awaiting their crosses. And then I imagine nearby, you'd hear the workmen preparing the crosses that would be taken by the convicts up to the hill of Golgotha. 3 crosses, hammering the rough-hewn wood together with a crude cross member. And then on the hill itself, others will be digging a hole deep enough to ensure that the crosses would stand under their own weight, plus that of a man attached. And I imagine that the criminals might have heard the hammering in the distance, knowing full well that this was preparation for their own execution. Now, what do you think a man thinks about the night before he's due to be executed? What does a man think about the night before he's due to be executed? Then you'd hear the noise of the hubbub from the crowd. And clearly something else was happening in the vicinity. The convicts would discern voices in the distance. It might well have been hard to distinguish what they were saying, but some words would have been clearer than others. And at one point, a voice bellows, "You are the King of the Jews." But whoever that was addressed to gave no answer. And then a prominent voice declares loudly, "I find no fault in him." Now, by this stage, the crowd was baying for blood. The air was full of angry shouting and hissing, and it felt as if something was about to explode. And then above the raucous disturbance, Barabbas suddenly heard his own name mentioned. "Who shall I release to you? Barabbas or..." The name of the alternative was actually unintelligible because the only thing Barabbas could hear was a chant, and the chant became louder and louder until the convicts could hear very clearly what was being said. "Crucify him, crucify him," they bellowed. Barabbas stiffened as he heard the sound of the soldiers coming along the steps down to his dark, dreary cell. Was this the call? Was this the time for his crucifixion? Barabbas broke into a cold sweat as the feet drew nearer, and his stomach turned sick with fear. "Now's the time's just up," he thought. "I'm going to have to go with this." And the soldiers dragged and pushed him to the surface. And Barabbas wasn't a particularly emotional man, but even he began to wonder whether this was his last gasp of fresh air, the last sight of the bright sun. And they dragged him through the yard and then directly onto the balcony of the governor's residence, where, to his horror, he looked down on that crowd of thousands. And then in the corner of his eye, he caught sight of another man, another convict, someone who'd evidently been flogged and spat upon. And just a little further in the distance, he caught sight of 3 crosses on a hill. Barabbas was puzzled by that. He knew that he and his 2 colleagues had been condemned to die on those crosses. He knew one of them had been set in position for him, his own personal cross, and yet here was a 4th man condemned to die. That didn't make sense. And what's more, this 4th man was facing the same charge of insurrection as he himself was facing. And the difference, of course, was that this man was truly innocent of the charge. But now there are 4 men, but still only 3 crosses. And as Barabbas looked down, he must have felt close to collapse. Maybe his punishment was to be launched into the air so that the mob could set upon him and tear him to pieces. And then the governor turns before the mob and rather strangely washes his hands publicly before them. And in those moments, as the hubbub subsided, as they'd been bellowing for somebody to be crucified, the warden turned to Barabbas, began to unlock the chains that bound him. Barabbas, he said, I've been ordered to set you free. Someone else is dying in your place. Now, we don't know subsequently what happened to Barabbas. We don't know whether Barabbas sort of slunk away in terror and relief, or whether he stayed around to watch the spectacle and the proceedings, whether he went back to tell his fellow criminals what had just happened. What did he do you think, with his newfound freedom? Do you think he continued to lead rebellions? Did he commit more murders? Or did he quietly walk off as fast as he could, never to be heard of again? So the question has changed. Imagine how you would react. What does a convicted criminal think about when someone else takes his place on death row? Think about that for a while. And imagine if you had been Barabbas. Imagine if you had been convicted and sentenced to death. Imagine if Jesus had died as your substitute. Then there's an additional question. What would you do with your freedom? And that's what I'm going to invite you now to ponder upon. Now, there are just 3 men and 3 crosses. That's a bit more easy to cope with, isn't it? But think about it. Think about it from Barabbas' perspective. We're going to hear some music. We're going to have a prayer. And I'd like you just to pause and think about those questions. What does a convicted criminal think about when someone else takes his place on death row? And if you were in that situation, what would you do with your freedom?
Freedom. Someone else is taking your place. Someone else is going to die. Could he believe he was free? Others remained shackled, 2 guilty as charged. A third, silently accepting his fate, was guilty of what? Guilty of taking the place of one who in the eyes of the law was a sinner. Could he even acknowledge that someone would make that kind of sacrifice? Despite the chains, despite the inevitable torment, there appeared no malice in his eyes, just compassion, a look of undying love for the sinner, a look that seemed to say, "This is for you, so that you can have life." Wherever I find myself, Lord, I can seek your love. Wherever I stand, Lord, I can acknowledge your sacrifice. Wherever I am, Lord, you look toward me, saying, "This is for you." Lord, remember me.
Jesus therefore stood before the governor, and the governor asked him and said, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" Jesus said unto him, "Thou sayest." And when he was questioned by the chief priests and by the elders, he answered them nothing. Then Pilate said unto him, "Hearest thou not these men's accusations?" And he answered him to never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled very greatly. That feast then the governor was accustomed to release unto the people one of the prisoners, which one they would. Now at that time the governor had a prisoner, more notable than the others, whose name was Barabbas. And when they were all assembled, Pilate said unto them, "That I release unto you Barabbas or Jesus, of whom it has been said he is Christ." For Pilate knew that it was for envy that they had delivered him. And when he was at the judgment seat, came one that his wife had sent, and said unto him,
"Have thou nothing to do with this just person? For I have suffered many things in a dream because of him."
But the scribes and the chief priests and the elders all persuaded the people to ask that Barabbas be released and that Jesus should perish. So the governor made answer unto the people, saying, Tell me whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? They answered, And Pilate said to them, What then shall I do unto Jesus, of whom 'tis said that he is Christ? They all made answer, therefore saw that he prevailed nothing, but that rather greater tumult rose. He took water, and washed his hands before them all, and said, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See then ye to it. And they answered him with one accord, and said, Jesus had been scourged, he delivered him up unto